Hello and welcome back to Jasmjtis, the conlang I made for fun. Today we're going to be talking about possessives and simple pronouns. As I mentioned in the previous video, there is no genitive case, so you have to do possessives in a sort of funky way. Today's example words: lother, to give birth; kenner, to forge; vedler, to cool or freeze; jter, which is the pronoun verb; and yer. Yer is the root word for both your voice and your authority. For instance, when you say, I gave him my authority to do that, you would say, I gave him my voice to do that. The basic possessive rule is you take the root word and you take the case, you separate them and you put a verb conjugation in between based on who possesses whatever it is you're talking about. When you're talking about, for instance, the mother, and as a side note, I've listed the mother and a mother differently because while in the spoken variety there is no definite article. In the written variety, if you want to imply a definite article, you use the majuscule at the beginning of a word. For instance, lothos with a capital L would be the mother, and lothos with a lowercase l would be just a mother. This applies to the beginning of a sentence too. You do not use the uppercase unless you want to imply a definite article. Tangent aside, if I wanted to talk about my mother, I would say lothalos. And if I wanted to talk about your mother, I would say lothasos. So on and so forth. You can see a few more examples below. With the third person, you need to establish who you're talking about before. Sort of how in English I can say I or you, and you would know who I'm talking about because you know who you are and you know who I am, more or less. I could still introduce myself earlier on in the conversation if you don't know who I am. But I can't just say he or she without establishing beforehand who he is or who she is. The same holds true with the possessive in this case. If I were to say Kenados, I wanted to talk about his sword, you'd have to know who he is beforehand. If you do not know who he is beforehand, I could introduce him in a previous sentence. For instance, I could say, he has a sword, his sword, blank. But another way you could say that is, he has a sword, it, blank. I'll talk more about jter in a later episode. For now, I'm just talking about it as a personal pronoun and going briefly over it as a general use pronoun. But Fivelios prefers multiple different ways to say the same thing to one thing meaning multiple different things, or in other words, ambiguity. He doesn't like ambiguity and tries to avoid it. So yer and jter, the two personal pronouns. I'll discuss the difference between these two in my next episode about tenses and moods. But basically, yalos is what I would use if I'm the agent of an action. Say, if I were to eat a sandwich, I'm the one eating the sandwich. So I would say yalos. But if I were to fall, you can't really say I'm the agent of the action because I'm not the one causing the fall. I'm not the one who's doing the action. Rather, you could say gravity is the one doing the action, and I'm simply the subject of the sentence. For that, you would say italos. And for first person inclusive plural, you would use jasmoi and itasmoi with the same distinction. That's the word. Now I'll discuss compound rules more in a later episode because they're a bit complicated. But one thing you'll notice is if you were to say Jasmi, that would just be we say. If you wanted to say our words as concepts,
You couldn't just say Jasmi because it would be the same thing. Again, Fivelios doesn't like ambiguity. So what you would do is if you have a compound word and you want to conjugate it as a concept, you would use jter. For instance, yaliti are my words, the words that I speak as concepts. If you wanted to talk about the actual sound of the words, you would use yalit. You would use yalas, or yalai rather. You wouldn't need the jter in that case. It's only if you're specifically conjugating it as a concept. Again, I talk about conjugation because every word is a verb, technically. But if you wanted to talk about our language, you'd use Jasmjtis. And if you wanted to talk about our words, you would use Jasmjti. That way you avoid the ambiguity of Jasmi versus Jasmjti. And as I said, I'll basically give you a brief overview of how jter works as a general purpose pronoun. Etos would be an object that I talked about previously. Etis would be a intangible object I talked about previously. Iti would be a plural of that. Etal would be an action I talked about previously. For instance, I ate the sandwich and I did the same to an apple and I did the same to an orange. So you would use etal for the second two sentences. Or independent clauses as I just spoke them out loud. But basically it takes the place of a previously established noun, verb, or preposition. Although in English we don't really have pronouns for verbs or prepositions. And that's it for possessives and pronouns.